Welcome to a new case file from the Investigator. Today, we are not looking into an ordinary crime. We are investigating the life of a woman whose history carries the strangest contradiction you might ever encounter. Imagine a face painted on church icons as a pious saint, and that same face etched in history books as one of the bloodiest and most brilliant criminal minds of the Middle Ages. We are in the 10th century AD, in the frozen forests of Eastern Europe, where laws do not rule, but instinct does.
Here, in Kyiv, a woman named Olga was born. But before she became a saint, she was a widow, driven by a kind of rage that time could not extinguish. Have you ever heard of a woman who killed an entire army using birds? Have you heard of a queen who received envoys seeking her hand in marriage, only to bury them alive in their boats while they wore their finest clothes?
The story of Olga of Kyiv is not just a tale of a woman grieving the loss of her husband. It is a study in criminal psychology and military brilliance. In this full-hour video, we will dive into the details that the volumes overlooked. We will analyze her tactics and reveal how she used psychological tricks before swords, and how she transformed from a broken widow into a goddess of revenge who burned an entire city to wash away her shame. Get ready, because what you will see and hear today will change your concept of the word saint forever. Was her revenge justified, or was she merely a butcher who used religion to cover her crimes? I am the Investigator, and today we begin the investigation into the case of the terrifying saint.
To understand the scale of the crime, you must understand its stage. We are in the era of the Kievan Rus, a tribal union that was in the process of transforming into an empire. These lands were a vast forest of pine and ice, where Slavic tribes lived at the mercy of Viking warriors who came from the north. Olga's husband, Prince Igor, was a powerful ruler, but he was afflicted with an incurable disease at that time: absolute greed.
Kyiv lived on a system known as pollude, which literally means circuit gathering among the people to collect tributes. Every winter, the ruler would go out with his army, passing through the tribes subject to him, taking everything: skins, honey, slaves, and gold. The Drevlian's tribe was the prime suspect in our story. They were a tribe living in dense forests, and they hated Kyiv as a prisoner hates the walls of his cell.
In 945 AD, Igor went out to collect taxes from the Drevlians. He got what he wanted, but on the way back, due to the whispering of his soldiers who craved more, he decided to return alone with a small force to demand an additional tax. Here, Igor made his fatal historical mistake. The Drevlians, led by their prince Mal, realized that the wolf would not stop eating until the flock was gone. Their prince said his famous sentence: "If a wolf gets used to the sheep, he will take the whole flock unless we kill him." And what they did to Igor was not just a killing, it was a terrifying message. Imagine the silent forest where snow covers everything, and suddenly the Drevlians pounce on Igor and his few soldiers. They did not want a quick death by the sword for him. They wanted a death that symbolized his unending greed. They bent 2 giant pine trees toward the ground, tied each of Prince Igor's legs to a tree, and then they released the trees. In a fraction of a second, the body of the Prince of Kiev was torn in half in a horrific cinematic scene where the white snow was stained with royal blood.
The news reached Kiev. Imagine Olga's situation. In that era, a widow was considered prey. She either had to kill herself at her husband's funeral, as was tradition, or wait for a new master to usurp her throne and her young son, Sviatoslav. But Olga was no ordinary woman. Behind those calm eyes, there was a mind that worked like a Swiss watch. While the Drevlians were celebrating in their capital, Iskorostan, thinking that Kiev had become leaderless, Olga was closing the doors of her palace. She did not cry in public. She did not scream. She was the investigator in waiting mode. She knew the Drevlians would make the mistake of arrogance. Indeed, Prince Mal sent a delegation of 20 of his finest nobles to Kiev. They did not come to apologize.
They came insolently to ask for Olga's hand in marriage to her husband's Kela. They thought they were offering her a life raft, but in reality, they were walking with their own feet toward the pit of hell that Olga had carefully dug.
The Drevlian delegation arrived in their boats via the Dnieper River. They wore the finest silk and leather, their chests puffed out with victory. Olga received them with a mysterious smile and spoke words recorded in history with the ink of cunning. "Welcome. Your offer pleases me, for my husband is dead and cannot return. But so that my people may see how much you respect me, go to your boats, and when my soldiers come tomorrow to summon you, tell them, we do not walk on foot, nor do they ride horses. Rather, carry us in our boats."
These fools thought Olga was raising their status before the people of Kyiv, and that she wanted them to be carried on shoulders like kings. They did not realize that this was a rehearsal for their funeral. All that night, Olga's workers were digging a deep and wide trench in the palace courtyard, a trench that was not intended for construction, but for burial.
The next morning, the soldiers of Kiev came. With all pride, the Drevlians refused to walk and asked to be carried in their boats. Indeed, the boats were carried on shoulders, with the nobles inside distributing smiles and promises, until they reached the courtyard, and suddenly, the soldiers threw the boats, along with those in them, into the deep trench. Olga appeared on the balcony, looking at them with a coldness that only the devil possesses. She asked them as she watched the dirt being heaped upon them while they were alive, "Do you find this honor sufficient for you?" Their muffled screams under the earth were the first movement in the symphony of her revenge that had not yet begun.
Olga was not satisfied with burying the 20 envoys alive. In her criminal mind, these were just appetizers in the banquet of blood. She realized that Prince Mao would wait for a response, so she decided to play on the chord of male vanity once again. She sent an immediate message to Prince Mao, saying with stunning coldness, "If you truly want me to come to you and marry your prince, then send me men of higher status and wisdom than these, so they may accompany me with dignity before my people." Here we see Olga's brilliance in purging the leadership. She did not want to kill only the soldiers, but wanted to annihilate the ruling class and the masterminds of the Drevlian tribe.
The trick worked on Prince Mao for the second time. He sent his best sages, his wealthiest merchants, and his close military leaders. The new delegation arrived in Kyiv, expecting a royal reception exceeding the previous one. Olga received them with the same lethal calmness and told them that the customs of the Rus required high guests to wash and purify their bodies from the fatigue of travel before meeting the queen. She offered them entry into the royal steam bath, banya, a sacred Slavic ritual symbolizing hospitality and safety.
The sages and nobles entered the bath, took off their armor and swords, and left their caution behind the closed doors. They were enjoying the hot steam, imagining themselves as the rulers of Kyiv tomorrow. But outside, the scene was completely different. While the steam was rising from the inside, Olga's soldiers were silently surrounding the wooden building. They placed massive iron locks on the doors and stacked piles of straw and dry wood round the walls. The bath was not a place for washing. It was a human furnace designed by Olga to end the second chapter of her revenge without having to draw a single sword. Olga gave the signal. The soldiers threw flaming torches onto the dry straw. In seconds, the wooden bathhouse turned into a ball of fire. Imagine the screams of the elite of the Drevlian tribe. These sages who thought that with their intelligence, they would control a broken widow. The temperature began to rise inside the bath, and it was no longer steam that filled their chests, but suffocating black smoke. They tried to push the doors, but they were locked with the force of hatred and revenge. Olga stood at a close distance, watching the fires as they consumed the building. She did not look away, nor did she show any sign of remorse. At that moment, she was not just a queen defending her throne. She was an engineer of destruction, studying the effect of fire in subduing enemies. The best minds of the Drevlians died in that bath, and with their death, the tribe became a body without a head and fighters without leaders. This act was not just a killing, it was a surgical operation to excise the enemy's political power. Olga had not gone to war yet, but in a few days, she eliminated 40 of the senior leaders and nobles using only psychological tricks. It reminds us of Sun Tzu's principle in the art of war. The skilled leader is the one who breaks the enemy's resistance without fighting. But Olga added her own touch, breaking the enemy through humiliating them and making them laugh as they walked to their grave. With the extinguishing of the bathhouse fires, nothing remained but ashes. The ashes of the elite that would pave the way for the great massacre that Olga planned in the heart of the enemy's home.
After Olga annihilated the leadership twice, she decided the time had come for her to move. But she did not go with a massive army raising war banners. Rather, she went as a grieving widow wanting to perform the Trisna ritual, a funeral feast held over the grave of the deceased. She sent a third message to Prince Mal. "I have killed the best of my men on my way to you." Another lie. "And I am now coming to you. Prepare massive quantities of honey wine, mead, near the place where you killed my husband, so that I may weep over his grave and bid him the final farewell, before I marry your prince." Olga arrived with a small force of her personal guards. The Drevlians, who had lost their sages and were left with only naive soldiers, believed her once again. They saw Olga weeping bitterly over the hill under which Igor was buried. The banquet was held, and the Drevlians began drinking the honey wine they had brought in insane quantities. Olga was smiling at them, encouraging them to drink, and pretending to be at peace. While her enemies were drowning in their drunkenness until they lost the ability to stand, she was giving silent signals to her soldiers who had not touched a single drop of wine. When the Drevlians fell into a heavy sleep resulting from excessive drunkenness, the square turned into a human slaughterhouse. Olga ordered her soldiers to slaughter everyone present. The historical records, Primary Chronicle, say that 5,000 Drevlian men were killed that night. It was not a battle, it was a harvest of souls. Olga stood among the corpses, and sadness no longer covered her face. Instead, the features of a predator who had finally closed its jaws appeared. She had annihilated the army that could have defended the city, all under the cover of holy grief. Now nothing remained before her except the city itself, Iskoristan, and the final trick that would make history tremble at the mention of her name. After the Trisna massacre that claimed the lives of 5,000 fighters, nothing remained before Olga except the fortified capital, Iskoristan. This city was the last stronghold of the Drevlians, built on rugged terrain and surrounded by massive wooden walls and stone ramparts designed to withstand the fiercest armies. Those who remained of the men, women, and children took refuge in it, trembling with fear of the Black Widow who was slowly approaching. Olga struck a suffocating siege around the city that lasted an entire year. But the problem lay in the fact that Iskoristan was a self-sufficient city equipped with massive food stores, and the Drevlians realized that their exit meant death, so they decided to hold out behind their walls, hoping that the winter would exhaust Olga's army and force her to withdraw. Here we see a new face of Olga's intelligence. She did not exhaust her army in suicidal attacks against the walls, but was silently watching from her royal tent. She knew that a material siege was not enough, rather the morale must be broken. She spent months studying the city's lifestyle. She saw pigeons and sparrows flying to and from the houses inside the walls, nesting under thatched roofs and returning safely every evening to their nests. At that moment, an idea flashed in her mind that had never occurred to any military general before, an idea that does not depend on catapults or direct fire, but depends on biology and the innate connection of creatures to their homes. Olga was preparing for something that would make the Drevlians wish they had died under swords instead of what awaited them. In a sudden moment, Olga stopped the skirmishes and sent an envoy to the city walls with a very strange message. She said, "Why do you continue to die of hunger? I have avenged my husband enough, and your other cities have submitted and started paying tribute and living in peace. I do not want gold or skins, for I know you are completely exhausted. I only want a simple and symbolic request as proof of your submission, and I will withdraw immediately after. Give me 3 pigeons and 3 sparrows from each house." Imagine the impact of this request on the ears of the hungry besieged.
The Drevlians mocked at first, then felt an indescribable relief. Is this the terrifying saint who burned the nobles? Is she satisfied with a few birds?
The Drevlians thought that Olga had grown tired of the war, or that her feminine spirit had finally overcome her, so she asked for delicate offerings. They did not realize that by collecting these birds, they were collecting the fuses of destruction for their homes with their own hands. The residents of Iskoristan collected the birds from their nests under the roofs of their houses, put them in cages, and handed them over to Olga's soldiers, exchanging laughs and congratulations on the end of the siege. Olga was watching the delivery of the cages with eyes as cold as Kiev's ice. To her, these were not birds, but guidance devices that did not miss the target. Once the cages were inside her camp, she gave her secret orders to her soldiers. Tie a piece of sulfur and a flaming rag with a long thread to the foot of each bird. The final stage of malicious engineering was complete, and nothing remained but to release the flying death. Sunset arrived, which is the natural time when birds return to their nests. Olga gave the signal, and the soldiers lit the fuses tied to the birds' feet and released them all at once. Imagine the terrifying scene from the perspective of the city's residents. Thousands of flaming points flying in the sky toward them. The birds were not fleeing away. They were rushing to return to their usual nests under the roofs made of dry straw and wood inside the city walls. In minutes, the city caught fire from the inside at thousands of points at once. There was not a single fire center that could be extinguished. It was a comprehensive fire explosion that covered every house, every store, and every corner. Iskoristan turned into a giant oven. People came running out of the flames, and Olga's soldiers were waiting for them at the exits. Those who did not die from being burned died from being slaughtered, and those who survived the slaughter were sold in slave markets. Olga stood before the great fire, in a surreal scene summarizing her might. She had destroyed the fortified capital without breaking a single door, and used the enemy's home to be his grave. This revenge was not just a reaction to her husband's murder. It was a political declaration in blood. Whoever dares to cross Kiev will be erased from the map of existence. With Iskoristan turning into a charred pile of ash, the story of the Drevlians as a people ended, and the legend of Saint Olga began, the one who burned the world to enlighten it with her power. But did the investigation end here? No, for what Olga did after that in Constantinople was even more cunning, where she manipulated the greatest emperors of the age.
After the smoke of the fires in Iskoristan ended, Olga did not return to Kiev to stay in her palace and enjoy her victory. Rather, she did something that no warring ruler before her had done. Olga, the investigator, realized that the reason for her husband's murder was not only the Drevlians' treachery, but the failure of the administrative system. She knew that relying on collecting taxes by force and randomness would always lead to bloody revolutions. Therefore, Olga carried out what can be called the first tax and legislative reform in the history of Eastern Europe. Olga toured all parts of her kingdom, not to collect tributes, but to demarcate boundaries, and established fixed laws, known as the Pogosti and Urok systems. Olga replaced the random circuit gathering system with a system of fixed administrative centers. These centers served as official government points, where each tribe committed to paying a specific amount at a specific time in exchange for the protection of the state and the law. Thus, she eliminated the individual greed of military leaders and put an end to the injustice that might drive tribes to rebel. Olga was not building just a financial system. She was sowing the seeds of central sovereignty. She transformed Kiev from just a gang of Vikings extorting villagers into an organized state with prestige and a legal structure. Historians see this reform as more important than all her wars because it ensured the stability of Kievan Rus for generations to come. In this paragraph, we see the transformation of the avenging widow into the skilled politician who realizes that the sword may open kingdoms, but the law alone is what preserves them. With internal stability, Olga directed her gaze toward the top, toward the greatest city in the world at that time, Constantinople. In 957 AD, Olga set out on an unprecedented journey in the history of the North. She left Kiev and headed south across the Black Sea toward Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire and the center of the Christian world. Olga did not go as a refugee or a conquering leader. She went as a head of state seeking international recognition and a strategic alliance. Imagine the scene, Olga's ships entering the Golden Horn, and before them the great walls of Constantinople and the Hagia Sophia church that touches the clouds manifest.
Olga realized that the military power of Kiev needed cultural and religious legitimacy to become a true empire.
Emperor Constantine VII Porphyrogenitus received her with an abundance of pomp and luxury. Constantine described this visit in detail in his book De Ceremoniis, on ceremonies. Here we see the investigator, Olga, observing the complex protocols of the Byzantine palace with precision. She knew that every movement, every look, and every word in this palace was part of a major political chess game. She was not impressed by the silk curtains or the mechanical throne that rises into the air. Rather, she was focused on how to get what she wanted from these Byzantines who think they are the smartest of humans. Emperor Constantine was impressed by her beauty, her poise, and her sharp intelligence, to the extent that, as the legends say, he fell in love with her and wanted to make her an empress by his side. But he did not know he was dealing with the woman who buried her enemies alive. Olga was preparing a diplomatic trap for him that history would record as one of the smartest religious and political maneuvers. Here we come to one of the greatest moments in Olga's biography. Olga declared her desire to convert to Christianity, a decision that had deep political dimensions to link Kyiv with the civilized world. Emperor Constantine agreed enthusiastically and even asked to be her godfather in the baptism, a great honor that linked them with a sacred spiritual bond. Olga was baptized in the great Hagia Sophia Church and took the name Helena after the mother of Emperor Constantine the Great. But as soon as the holy water dried on her head, Emperor Constantine came forward to ask for her hand in marriage again, thinking that this was the perfect time to annex Kievan Rus to Byzantine influence. Olga smiled with her usual coldness and dropped her diplomatic bomb that paralyzed the thinking of the emperor and his generals. She said to him, "O Emperor, how can you marry me when you have now become my spiritual father and my godfather in Christianity? The laws of the church I have just joined forbid the marriage of a father to his spiritual daughter. Isn't that so?" The emperor fell into his own trap. It was he who insisted on being her godfather to enhance his influence, so she used this insistence to make the marriage religiously and legally impossible. Constantine realized he had been deceived by a barbarian, as he thought, and said his famous sentence, "You have outwitted me, Olga." Olga did not return to Kyiv as just a follower of the new religion. She returned as a saint and independent ruler who was able to extract the empire's recognition without making political or marital concessions. Olga proved that the investigator can conquer hearts and minds with simple words, just as she conquered forts with fire and birds.
Olga returned to Kyiv, but she did not return as just that widow who left seeking a political alliance. She returned carrying in her heart a new cosmic vision that would flip the balance of power in Eastern Europe forever. Olga was no longer satisfied with just laws and taxes. She realized, as a skilled investigator, that a strong state needs a single spirit to gather the fragments of the feuding tribes. And she saw in Christianity that bond that would bring her people out of the darkness of the forest into the lights of Byzantine civilization. She brought with her priests, holy books, and icons, and began building the first churches in the heart of Kyiv, led by St. Nicholas Church. But the mission was not as easy as she thought, for Kyiv was not just a city, it was a stronghold for the god of thunder, Perun, and the god of wealth, Veles. Imagine the cultural shock that occurred. Varangian Viking warriors who believed that entering heaven, Valhalla, requires death with a sword in hand, found themselves before a queen calling them to tolerance, fasting, and kneeling to a crucified god. The pagan priests, Volkovs, began to feel the danger to their influence, and whispers began to rise in the dark alleys of Kyiv about the madness of the queen who sold her ancestors' gods for the religion of foreigners. Here we see Olga in a difficult position. She cannot use fire and birds to impose religion as she did with the Drevlians, because she realizes that faith is not planted with fear, but with conviction. Olga began practicing quiet proselytizing, trying to start with her home first, specifically with her son Sviatoslav, who had begun to grow up and turn into a ruthless war beast. She knew that the success of her project depended on convincing this young man, who
who sees Christianity as a religion for the weak. Here we come to one of the most human and politically complex moments in Olga's career, the meeting that brought together Helena, Olga's Christian name, and her son Sviatoslav I. Sviatoslav represented the peak of warrior masculinity in the Viking Age, a man who does not sleep under a roof but spreads his horse's saddle on the ground, and does not eat cooked food but cuts slices of raw meat and grills them on the campfire. For him, war was the only prayer, and sovereignty was the only religion. Olga tried with all the wisdom and cunning she possessed to convince him of baptism, saying to him, "My son, I have known the true God, and if you are baptized, the whole people will follow you." But Sviatoslav's response was shocking and decisive, recorded in the manuscripts as one of the strongest responses in history.
Sviatoslav said to her with the insolence of a warrior, "How can I embrace another religion? My army, Druzhina, will laugh at me and mock me if I do that." He saw in Christianity an obstacle to the fighting spirit. For how can a warrior conquer kingdoms while believing in, "Whoever strikes you on your right cheek, turn to him the other"? In this paragraph, we see the collision of two worlds. Olga's world, which looks to the future, to building a diplomatically and religiously stable empire, and Sviatoslav's world, which looks to the past, to the glory of conquest, looting, and direct collision. Olga was deeply saddened, not only as a queen, but as a mother seeing her son reject the path of salvation. But she, as a realistic investigator, did not pressure him to the point of rebellion. Rather, she left him the military leadership, and she kept the administrative and civil leadership for Kiev. Sviatoslav remained pagan until his death, but he allowed his mother to practice her religion, which created a fragile coexistence in Kiev under the shadow of his great swords. While Sviatoslav was touring the world with his armies, destroying the Khazar Empire in the east and invading the lands of the Bulgars in the south, Olga was the actual ruler and the beating heart of Kiev. Here we see Olga's greatness that does not appear in battlefields, but in the stability of the state. She was the one managing crises, receiving delegations, and ensuring that food and money did not run out while the king was busy with blood. In 968 AD, Olga faced the most dangerous test in her late life. The Pechenegs took advantage of Sviatoslav's and his army's absence and struck a terrifying siege around Kiev. Olga was inside the walls with her grandchildren, including little Vladimir, and the city was on the verge of falling from hunger and thirst.
At this moment, Olga's old cunning appeared once again. She knew that the Pecheneg army thought that Kiev was without protection, so she managed a complex optical and psychological deception operation to trick the enemies into believing that Sviatoslav's army was standing on the other bank of the river. She sent a brave knight to swim across the river, pretending to be a vanguard for the large army, and in coordination with the remaining small forces, she fooled the Pechenegs into believing that Sviatoslav's hammer had arrived. The Pechenegs retreated in fear of Sviatoslav's terrifying reputation, and Olga was able to save the city and her grandchildren from certain annihilation. When Sviatoslav finally returned, he found his mother had preserved his throne and his city with her intelligence and not with her sword. But Olga felt her end approaching, and she was afraid of only one thing: that all her Christian and civilizational reforms would collapse as soon as she left, leaving Kiev in the hand of a son who loves war and hates stability. In this paragraph, we see Olga as the steadfast shield of Kiev, the woman who did not allow history to pass her by, even when she was in the autumn of her life. We are now in the year 968 AD, and Olga is in the autumn of her life, but the spirit of the Investigator has not been extinguished yet. While her son Sviatoslav was away pursuing military glory in Bulgaria, the predatory Pecheneg tribe saw an irreplaceable opportunity to snatch the mother of Russian cities. They struck a suffocating siege around Kiev and cut off water and provisions from it. Olga was inside the walls, not just as a ruler, but as a grandmother protecting her small grandchildren, including Vladimir, who was watching his grandmother managing the crisis with amazing calm.
Imagine the psychological pressure. The city is on the verge of surrendering from thirst, and the enemy surrounds the walls like hungry wolves. Here, Olga managed her last tactical operation. She sent a brave knight to swim across the Dnieper River under the cover of night, fooling the Pechenegs that the vanguard of Sviatoslav's terrifying army had reached the other bank. Olga used the psychology of fear associated with her son's name to intimidate the enemies, and indeed the Pechenegs retreated, thinking they would face Hurricane Sviatoslav. Olga saved Kyiv once again with her intelligence, not with her sword, and proved to her army and her people that wisdom is the fortress that never falls. But this victory was mixed with the bitterness of disease, for Olga felt her body starting to fail her, and that the mission she had dedicated her life to was about to reach its final station. In July 969, Olga was lying on her deathbed in her palace in Kyiv. Her son Sviatoslav entered to her, and instead of sadness, he told her with the coldness of leaders that he intended to move the capital from Kyiv to Pereoslavets on the Danube River, because he preferred living in the heart of battles and taxes. Here we see human weakness in its strongest form. Olga looked at him and said in the tone of a broken mother, "My son, do you not see that I am sick? Where are you going and leaving me? Bury me first, then go where you want." Olga remained resisting death for only 3 additional days in order to bid farewell to her son, who never understood her spirit. Before breathing her last on July 11, 969, Olga left a will that was like a final bomb she detonated in the face of pagan traditions. She forbade holding the Trizna, the pagan funeral feast, over her grave, and explicitly requested that her priest Gregory bury her according to Christian rituals in a secret place. Olga died clinging to her new identity until the last breath, defying the will of her powerful son and his pagan army. The Black Widow, who became a saint, passed away, leaving behind a massive political and spiritual vacuum. Sviatoslav grieved for her and wept bitterly despite their differences, but he did not realize that his grandmother's cross, which he mocked, had already begun to plant its roots in the mind of one of the children she used to tell stories to before bed.
Historians say that Olga was the morning star that precedes the sunrise, for it was she who paved the way for the light that her eyes did not see while she was alive. Although Sviatoslav remained pagan, the seeds she planted in her grandson Vladimir were stronger than his father's swords. Vladimir, who watched his grandmother's intelligence in managing the state and her wisdom in facing crises, never forgot that calmness from which she derived her strength. Years after her death, specifically in 988 AD, Vladimir made the decision that changed the fate of Eastern Europe forever, embracing Christianity and making it the official religion of the state. When Vladimir's advisors asked about the reason for his choice of Orthodox Christianity, their conclusive argument was, "If this religion were not the truth, your grandmother Olga, who was the wisest of humans, would not have embraced it." The image of the avenging widow in popular memory was transformed into the spiritual mother of the nation. Thus, Olga's greatest and final revenge was achieved, not by burning cities, but by burning paganism itself and replacing it with a civilization she wanted to build since the moment her feet touched Constantinople. Olga proved that the true investigator is the one who plants a tree, knowing he will not sit under its shadow, but trusts that his grandchildren will pick its fruits. Today, as we close the file on the terrifying saint, we realize that her power was not in the fire she released, but in the faith that no one could extinguish.
Here we reach the essence of our file today, the mystery that puzzles every historical investigator and psychologist. How can a woman who buried envoys alive and burned an entire city in cold blood be raised on altars as a saint equal to the apostles? The title equal to the apostles, is apostolos, which the church officially granted her in 1547, is the highest spiritual medal a human can obtain, and it is reserved for those who made historical shifts in the course of the faith. But does baptism erase the smell of ash? To understand this contradiction, we must dive into the mind of the Middle Ages, where justice was not an abstract legal concept, but a religion based on responding in kind to protect the survival of the tribe. Olga did not kill out of sadism, but was a political surgeon, excising a rebellion that would have destroyed Kyiv from its foundations. Her transition from the pagan law of blood to the Christian law of the spirit represents a radical shift in the psychology of rule. Instead of avenging the dead, she began to think about saving the living and building a nation that does not die with the death of its king. For the church, Olga was the investigator who found the truth in the heart of the forest, and her baptism in 957 was not just a ritual, but a declaration of the end of the forest era and the beginning of the book era. Olga was able to make her bloody past fuel for her political prestige, and the holiness of her present a shield for her people's future. She is the character who proves to us that history does not travel in straight lines, but in overlapping circles of light and darkness, and that greatness sometimes requires an iron heart as much as it requires a pious soul. In the end, the story of Olga of Kyiv is not just a tale about a woman's revenge, but a tale of the birth of a whole civilization from the womb of ash. Olga passed away in 969, but she left behind a living prophecy manifested in her grandson Vladimir. When Vladimir stood hesitating before choosing a new religion for his people in 988, philosophical arguments were not what settled his decision, but rather the memory of his grandmother, where his advisors told him clearly, if this religion were not the best, your grandmother Olga, who was the wisest and smartest on earth, would not have embraced it. Olga was the key that opened the door of history for Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus to enter the international system. Today, while visitors look at her calm icons in churches, not many see behind those delicate features the burning birds or the trench that swallowed the nobles. But as investigators, we realize that power is what created this holiness. Olga proved that the great ruler is the one who possesses the vision to see beyond the horizon, the courage to do what is necessary, and the wisdom to know when to put down the sword and pick up the cross. She was the morning star that heralded a sun that did not rise until 20 years after her death. And now, while we close the file on the terrifying saint, the question remains hanging in your minds. Does the historical goal justify those bloody means? Or was Olga a victim of her time as much as she was its maker? Share your opinions with us in the comments. And do not forget that the truth always lies between the lines and in the folds of ash. I am the investigator, and the case is closed.